and the importance of healthy mental development in infancy. And I hope if you look at that sheet that has the theory of development on there, if you look at that, and it says mental, if they do not have good reciprocal relationships in infancy, where they develop the trust, safety, and security, it's going to affect them later on. So our whole mental health crisis in the United States or in the world, my belief is, could all be solved in infancy. Or a lot of it, I shouldn't say all. Because of this very thing right here. It's relationships equal attachment equals success. Okay? Well, you say, oh, well, so what? You know? We have things, though, people saying things like, don't spoil that child. Don't pick up that baby. You will spoil that baby. Let that baby cry it out. You heard those kinds of things? That is a bunch of baloney. And I get really passionate about this, so if I offend you, I'm sorry. But that's a bunch of baloney. You cannot spoil a child in the first year of life because the only way that child has to communicate with us is through crying or some way through their behavior. And when they're an infant, they are crying because they have a need that needs to be met. They're either scared because they just entered a big world after being inside the womb, very, very safe and secure, and they've come into this big world, and they're scared, or they're hungry, or they just need to know that there's somebody there. And the only way they have to communicate that need is crying. You cannot spoil an infant in the first year of life, and I don't believe even up until about age 2. They do not have the mental capacity to manipulate any adult. Think about this. To be able to manipulate someone, you have to use this part of your brain. What is this part of your brain? Frontal lobe. That does what?
Reasoning.
Reasoning. An infant doesn't have that mental capacity. I'm sorry. Okay? So you cannot spoil an infant in the first year of life. And the thing that troubles me the most is, as I think I've already mentioned probably a couple of times, is that the foundation for faith in Christ is laid in that first year through that trust. And if they don't learn that in infancy, it's not that they can't learn it later on. It's not that God can't work miracles. It just becomes harder and harder. 80%, listen to this, 80% of the children in the United States are at risk for attachment disorder. Mental health crisis? You bet. 80%.
What is that attributed to?
Okay, we're going to talk about that. It's coming up. 80%. That should scare you. It should scare you because if you're doing a great job as a parent, you're doing a great job of attached with your child, with your infant or your young child. But what about those other people out there that isn't happening to? Your children are going to be growing up with those children.
And marrying those children.
And marrying those children. Exactly right. And if we had time, I could tell you some stories about that, too. Because I have a daughter-in-law that had this exact problem. And she has spent her whole life trying to deal with it. And is still dealing with it. Okay? All right. Okay. Okay, let's see if I told you all that. Relationships also form the basis for behavior. Forms the basis for your child's behavior. Okay? And we'll talk more about that in just a moment. Okay. So, what keeps us What keeps us from developing these attachments with our children? Even when we think we're doing a good job. Look at that picture. What does that say to you?
Isolation.
Okay. That's a picture of parents who are present but not present. Can you see that? What's the look on that child's face?
What's that?
She's sad. She's wanting attention from her parents, and she's not getting it. When children misbehave, oh, I hate to even use that word. When some of children's behavior is saying, I need connection. We used to, a lot of things you would read, it would talk about children being attention seeking. What children are really doing is they are connection seeking. They want to make connection with you, okay? But so often you can be in a room and not be in a room.
Is introversion, extroversion part of this development, or is that something probably more hardwired? I mean, I know there's
Right. Personality types figure a little bit into this, but not so much when it comes to the attachment kind of thing. It has more to do with how they would express that, more so than the attachment itself. Does that make sense? Okay. All right. A child's brain responds more strongly to her mother's voice than the voice of strangers. Now, this is talking about mothers, but it also deals with fathers. The brain regions engaged are not just auditory processing, but also with emotion and social functions. Spending time with your child during this critical period means she will have a greater chance of being emotionally secure and resilient to stress, and better able to regulate her emotions throughout life. Read other social cues, achieve a higher emotional intelligence, and connect with others. This is a new study that just came out not too long ago. I want you to look at that picture. That's another picture of the parent being there but not being there. This is what's called secondhand exposure to technology. Technology is separating us from our children. Technology, which is supposed to be a good thing, it started out being a good thing, is doing all kinds of crazy things to us as parents and children. It's because what this baby is saying, or is what the brain of this baby is saying and thinking is, there's my mom, she's not engaging with me. So I'm not getting any feelings of safety or security, and so I don't know, I'm getting confused, okay? So technology is a big problem to the attachment, okay? And it creates a lot of stress, which is what this video was going to tell us. And when the stress that takes place inside the brain, if it's a continual type of stress, then it can actually alter the brain structure. Oh, it's working, but we have no sound. Okay, you want to just see it for a minute? No. This is like the levels of cortisol that's filling the body. But when the stress is created and if there is a loving, nurturing person there to comfort, then it makes a difference. But if there's not, then the brain becomes wired for a negative outcome.
So that would be why some people don't know how to function in a non-crisis stress
So the brain is wired in fight or
environment.
flight.
It's been addicted to adrenaline and cortisol and everything from the get-go.
They do not know how to calm that brain down, okay? One of the reasons why this happens is that there's a part of the brain called the amygdala. And to help you kind of understand that a little bit, take a couple of almonds. Everybody needs 2 almonds. And I want you to put them in the palms of your hands. And I want you to close them out. Okay, so if we took our fist and we put them together and put our thumbs here, this could kind of be a model of our brain. Okay? This would be like the frontal lobe here. Deep inside each hemisphere, there's a little part of the brain called the amygdala. Anybody heard of the amygdala? That amygdala is a very important part of the emotional systems of the brain, or emotional system of the brain. But the amygdala is active at birth. It's the part that helps in determining that fight or flight situation. It's the part of the brain that looks at an experience that you're having. A child's brain would look at an experience and think, okay, is this something I need to be afraid of? Is this not a safe situation? How do I feel? Am I going to try to do that fight or flight thing? So it alerts the brain that there might be danger. So when that happens, it reacts very quickly. And when it gets on what we call a high alert, it can take a long time for it to come back down and be deactivated. Okay? For children who have these types of experiences, if there's not that person that's there to help calm them, to help them feel safe and secure, then that brain stays on that, and so that brain becomes more wired for those levels of anxiety, those levels of stress, of uneasiness, all of those kinds of things, okay? What you didn't hear, you kind of saw it in that, but you didn't hear was that if there is that person, parent, or caregiver that is there to help calm and respond, then that brain can kind of come back into a state of calmness or more of an even reaction, okay? It's active at birth. Got that? But what if it doesn't calm them? If it doesn't calm them, then they're still going to be on that level of high alert. So you would need to see what might calm them. If like a responsive holding, cuddling doesn't respond to them, then there may be something else going on. It takes a long time to calm it down sometimes when it gets really high. But when I was talking to you about the fact that you can't spoil an infant in the first year of life, this is what it's about. What if a young baby starts crying and just keeps crying and nobody picks that baby up? What is the brain? What's happening in the brain? What's happening to levels of cortisol.
We're skyrocketing.
They're going up, 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 up. What happens to babies if they continually have that type of response during the first year of life and nobody is responding to them? They become what's called silent weepers. They just stop crying. They stop having any type of emotion, almost. It can happen that quickly. Okay? So it's very, very important for young children to have that relationship, that attachment to parents, primarily. That's the most important people in their life. Should be. If not, there needs to be that person who can be that consistent caregiver, because it's so important. Okay. What was I going to tell you? I was thinking about something like that. I forgot. Okay. So you have two of them, one in each hemisphere. So just remember that. And that it rarely forgets. That means that our brains start to store emotional memories from birth. And you have emotional memories stored in your brain that you may not even be consciously aware of unless something happens to trigger that emotional memory. That's why, do any of you have adopted children? Maybe you adopted children, child? Adopted children continue to have a sense of abandonment, even if they were adopted and raised in a very loving, nurturing home. Because that sense of being taken from the mother at birth left a sense of loss, because the mother, they were already recognizing the mother's voice in utero. It's because it was stored in the amygdala.
Can the same thing happen with the absence of a father?
It's not, it can, it's not, doesn't seem to be as profound. Is because they they recognize the father's voice, but it's not as profound as it is because they've heard the mother's voice more. But yes, they can. Okay. So, what disconnects us? When we give babies stimulants instead of calming attention and offer tech distractions from ordinary life instead of guidance through, we teach them at a very young age to deal with life's ups and downs by plugging into external sources to self-regulate rather than develop skills with it. This is talking about the fact that young children are being exposed to technology, because so many people, and I'm sure it's not you because you're here, is that if you need something to soothe the child, you put a screen in front of it. Don't do that. Don't do that, please don't do that. Statistics tell us that 74% of children under 2 watch TV, and the American Academy of Pediatrics is now saying that you shouldn't let any child under 18 months, which I totally disagree with. It should be at least 2. Because of the very fact that it disconnects, and it also can build those levels of cortisol. You don't know what those things that they're seeing that is stimulating their brain. You do not know exactly what all it's doing to their brain. We do know that there are studies that do tell us that it affects the behavior of young children. I don't know if you've read any of the studies that have been out there, but there have been studies and experiments of where parents have taken technology away from their children, and they screamed and they carried on, and it was awful because it's like a drug. But once they got out of that, they were totally different children. That's how powerful it is. And I read a new study just today that said that they are putting screens in front of babies as young as 2 and 3 months old. If you go to restaurants, you know that. Right? Where there's no interaction. I went to a restaurant not too long ago and sat there with a baby in a carrier, and the parents sat there. Each of them were on their phone, and they never looked at that baby, and they were there for an hour. And the baby had no interaction with them. What I thought was probably happening was that that baby had gotten so used to that he was no longer trying to make connection. That's that silent weeper. And that's happening, folks. That's happening. I see it all the time. Okay. 60% of children under 3 watch videos, 74% watch 2, I've said that already. Ages 2 to 5 spend 32 hours a week in front of screens. Video game playing directly or indirectly disrupts the development of preferable neural systems related to verbal intelligence. What that means is that it delays language development. It's simply what that says. It's because the brain is slower to develop when they spend a lot of time in front of screens. And what have we said about maybe elementary age children when they don't have the verbal skills, they don't have the social cues, all those kinds of things? It's because they may be spending too much time in front of screens. Okay? Whether 5 months old, 5 years old, or 15 years old, when our kids are feeling scared, anxious, or stressed, we consistently respond in a safe and secure way. Our children come to believe we're available and capable of loving them. This gives our child a safe foundation to explore, and the ability to freely explore builds her self-confidence. See, what we want to build in young children is that sense of self-confidence, that sense of security, and it doesn't happen if we don't spend time with them. Okay, any questions about that? Any thoughts on that? You can agree, disagree, if you want.
Anybody else feeling like a loser?
I'm just curious, from the screen, the child watching the screen, does it make a difference what the parent puts on that screen?
No.
Doesn't.
What makes the difference is whether or not a parent is watching it with them.
Okay.
It makes a difference, it's not quite as bad, if there is a parent there that kind of interacts with them. But that should be for no more than an hour. No, there's no research that says that they learn language better. Matter of fact, it's worse. That if they're looking at words on a screen, they learn language by having conversations one-on-one or in a group with relationships, okay? And I'm not here to make you feel bad. I don't want you to feel necessarily bad, but I want you to have this information because I think it is so critical.
Well, I said that because we're in a unique situation. We were at the finish line. We've seen the outcome, and we see our 18-year-old knowing some way how to cope and some way not knowing how to cope, and we think we're doing a better job with the 3-year-old, but at the same time, we're old and tired.
And parents are tired. You're tired, right? I tell you, when I keep my granddaughter at the end of the day, I'm exhausted. But I have not put her in front of the screen. Because we've seen, when my granddaughter was born, of course my son knows I've been in education forever, and he knows that he knows some of this. And so we vowed we weren't going to even have the TV on in the room when she was a baby. And we didn't. We didn't. We would not even get our phones out when she was awake. And we did that for about 6 to 8 months. And then one day, all of a sudden, it was like she kind of woke up and she knew exactly what a phone was. And we never even hardly even had it out. I think they're born knowing what this is. But try very hard to keep that from her. And we have done a fairly good job of that. But she still now, I mean, she wants the phone because she, you know, when the phone rings, you have to answer the phone, and she sees the phone, and she'll say phone. But she knows her pictures are on the phone. And there are good things about technology. It FaceTime connects us with families all over, so that's the good thing about technology.
I will tell you from our experience, again, we both are a little more willing to go, man, this, you turn around twice, they're gone. Yep, I'm going to get down on the floor and play.
Exactly.
But I also, the second time around, I'm not in grad school, and, you know, the demands, I think, on all of us are more than any God ever intended.
That's because our society, our hurriedness, our busyness, all of our society, I think, has gotten us to this point. And the thing about it is that it's our children that are suffering. And I've been in education and around children long enough to know that I see this in children. When I am in groups of children, I see sadness on their faces.
We've got teacher, social worker, teacher, probation officer.
Don't you see sadness on their faces?
Student.
I walk into these classrooms of these 2 and 3 and 4-year-olds, and what I see on their faces, for not maybe all of them, but for the great majority of them, there is sadness on their faces. I used to not see that. And like I said, I've been in education a long time. I've taught preschoolers for about 40 years. I used to never see that. Children were joyful. Children were happy. Now there's sadness on their faces. There is a reason for that, folks. And we have got to do something about it. And you can start with your own children. And it takes, as you said, it takes time to get down in the floor. It takes time to look them one-on-one. It gives time to give them attention. Because that attention, that behavior is simply, I want a connection with you. We are wired, God wired our brains for being and needing connections and relationships.
So share with us, because the reality of you can't give a child 24/7.
Right, and it's not saying-
physically impossible.
And it's not 24/7. It is just being available. That relationships are so important. That's number one. Another way is to just prioritize the fact that they need movement and play. Unstructured play, okay? That means that you are just going to provide an environment for them in which they can have unstructured play, meaning that they can make up their own rules. It doesn't have to be an organized sport. They just need to know that you're available. If you spend time over here with them in their relationship, then they're going to feel freer to play alone or with another child or with a group of children. But they need that time to play. The problem is that we've been so busy keeping our kids in boxes and containers like bucket seats, strollers, bouncy chairs, that we don't give them the freedom to move, which they need for optimal brain development, because if they don't develop their core muscles have everything to do with whether or not they can pay attention. That's another conference. Their physical development actually plays a large role into whether or not they can learn to attend or to pay attention or to focus. Because so much of that skill is actually built into our muscles. So they need opportunities to just play, because what's happening is we have two sides of the brain, like I said. The right side of the brain is the part of the brain that develops first, and it's the part of the brain that actually most children from about birth to 3 operate out of. This is the part of the brain that thinks about the present. It thinks about the big picture. This is more of the global part of the brain, for another word, okay? The left side of the brain is the more part of the brain that has to do with your logic, it thinks about the past and the future. It thinks in language, because that's where most of your language centers are. So it's your more analytical side of the brain, where a lot of that processing takes place. What's happening is that we don't really understand that this is where children are in the right side of the brain, but what we're asking them to do, especially in school and other places, we're pushing all these academics down on children that aren't ready for them. Because we now want our 4-year-olds to be like it's in kindergarten, and kindergarten has to be like a first grade. And what that is doing is that it's pushing all of that down onto a child whose brain is not ready for those types of things. And if your brain isn't ready to learn those types of things, then what do you think that creates?
Cortisol.
Cortisol, exactly. It's stress. So we're actually asking kids to do things that they are not yet ready to do. And so that creates more stress. And giving them, instead of giving them time for movement and play and all that kind of stuff. And it is that play that develops this part of the brain. It's that unstructured play when children have to learn to make up their own rules, develop their own games, be bored, that develops this higher level thinking part of the brain. Okay? We don't realize that the land of childhood is whole before we arrive. Within their world, children's behavior has logic and meaning. We do not respect the world of childhood. We judge childhood from our adult views. Does that make sense?
See, I would say we judge parents by children's behavior,
That's true too. But
which means that we want to create little adults.
exactly. We're on the same page. It's exactly right. But in doing that, we don't understand that when a child does some things that they do, it makes perfectly sense to them. This is my granddaughter stepping on watercolors. Does that make sense to us as an adult normally?
She want to do footprint?
She just wanted to step on them because she just thought it was fun. That made perfect sense to her. The picture that I did have up here that I could not find when I got ready to do this was a picture of her in her car seat in June with a sweater, no, her jacket, her coat, her winter coat, her cap, and her gloves in June.
Some battles are
Texas.
just not worth fighting.
And my son took the picture and he sent it to me and he said, "Would you just look at what she's wearing?" But my son knew enough not to force the issue. Because what had happened to my granddaughter? My son and daughter-in-law moved from Dallas to Austin in March so they could be closer to us. My granddaughter, from a period of January to about June at that time, that's 6 months, she moved from the only house she'd ever known. She moved to a whole new house. She couldn't understand where her room was, even though they did a good job of trying to prepare her. She went to a new school. Anyway, her whole world had just been turned upside down. She was really experiencing a loss. It was like someone going through a death. But she had this loss of her world as it had always been. Well, she was very much last winter a lover of her coat, and a lover of her gloves, and a lover of her cap. She would put that on every morning last winter. That was the sense of security for her. So that made total sense to her. Just as this makes total sense to her because she wants to explore that. What I'm trying to say is that we need to respect the world of childhood because it's a thing and it's a viable place. And we don't necessarily need to put our adult values on childhood. We need to let children be children. So, anyway, we don't need to always think about we've got to prepare them for. We always seem to be thinking we've got to prepare them for kindergarten. We've got to prepare them for this. We've got to prepare them for this. And not that some of that's not important, but we're so busy preparing them for that we forget that we need to be in
So our struggle, or I don't know if it's a struggle, but the potty training.
Uh-huh.
Preparing, there's expectations, it's, I mean,
Mhm.
how much stress do you have?
I would not stress a child over potty training. Because most of the time, children will potty train with encouragement when they are ready. You create more stress by forcing some of those issues than you do by just kind of letting them lay out. But then you have to deal with, well, my child's potty trained, yours isn't potty trained, right?
Yeah.
Or they can
Parents
do it in the
self-soothing.
next class at school, so they're not potty trained.
Those are when they're getting ready. I have 2 children who were like just a couple months shy of 4 before they decided they were ready. I have one who's not even 3 yet, who's potty trained, so
It's all very
when they're
individual.
ready.
It's all individual. Right.
But
But we do have
it's
that.
the parental and the school, the demand, external expectations,
Exactly,
and figuring out how to soothe our own insecurities and anxieties.
exactly. That's exactly right. And my point there is that we don't, I get so upset at some of the educational systems that won't make it, that every child has to do the same thing at the same time, same age. It is so wrong. It is so wrong.
Well, when it's, you can't move to the next class until you're potty trained as parents, you basically have to decide which one is gonna cause less stress. I mean, neither one is a good option, so you have to pick between a rock and a hard place.
That's exactly right. And I wish it wasn't that way.
Right. It is.
But there are some schools though that are now saying, we will work with your child. Your child is an individual. Not all. I'm hoping more will come around, but that's the way it should be. Because you shouldn't say because your child's 3 years old, he's going to this place, he's got a potty train. Because what you're doing is you're forcing